Welcome to Roleplaying History, the podcast where we explore the history of role-playing games. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'll be your guide for today's tour. Episode 126, Castle Faulkenstein and Talislanta. This week we're going to dive back into game systems with a look at two systems I've had my eye on for quite some time, and they both bring system components to the table that I found interesting, and I hope you will as well. But before we get into that, and I know we don't usually do new news on here, I came across something on my Facebook feed the other day that I thought you might find interesting. If you think back almost a year, the entire month of December, we did episodes. One of them was based on fandoms. One was based on other books, so on and so forth. And one of the things I talked about at the time was the game Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Other Strangeness, based on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And I mentioned at the time that the game is out of print, which is true until I saw this thing on Facebook. Palladium Books has started a Kickstarter to bring Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles back to the tabletop role-playing world. The idea is that they're going to have two volumes. Basically, it's going to be the core game and some of the supplements, and they're bringing it back, full-color artwork, doing a few updates here and there to kind of modernize it a wee bit, but it's going to be hardcover books. Very interesting. I'm actually looking at the Kickstarter.com page for the game right now. They have 25 days to go in their campaign as I'm recording this. Their goal was $250,000. They've already doubled that. They're at $522,000 and change. So if you're interested in getting Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Other Strangeness, because maybe you want to relive your childhood, maybe you want to introduce your kids, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is the way to do it, head over to Kickstarter.com, check out that campaign, and get to it. Okay, so I did some new news, which is something I don't do. Now let's crank up the tour bus and get to the first stop on today's tour. Castle Faulkenstein was designed by Mike Pondsmith and released by R. Talsorian Games in 1994. Checking in at a rather hefty 224 pages, the release was a softcover with cover art from William Eakin and Mark Schumann. In 2000, Steve Jackson Games produced a GURPS version of the game per its license agreement, and in 2016, Fat Goblin Games signed a deal with R. Talsorian Games to create new supplements using the original 1994 rules. Curious Creatures was one of the first of these releases, and it dropped in 2016. Now, normally when there's not a second edition, you'll hear me say those dreaded words, "since it's no longer in print." In this case, I checked the R. Talsorian website, and they've continued to run new printings of the game, so while you might be able to find one at your local game shop, the best spot to check would be that website, and it's talsorianstore.com. That's TALSORIANSTORE.com. They've also got a selection of supplements you can purchase to augment your experience. Oh, and just so you know, a copy of the rules is going to run you $40 US. Getting into the game itself, Castle Faulkenstein begins with a rather interesting premise. The game has been written by a computer game designer who was kidnapped by a fairy king and brought to the land of New Europa, which is basically a version of the Earth in the 1890s. So the game is the record of the adventures of a 20th century designer in a 19th century world that's parallel to, but not the same as, our world. And I get that it might seem a bit confusing on the surface, but the concept was just interesting enough to get me to push past it and dig deeper, and I gotta be honest, I'm glad I did. The gamebook itself is split into two sections. The setting, which is called Spellnapped, and the game, which is called The Great Game. And the book starts with a warning that lets you know it's organized differently than other games, since the setting is up front and the rules come later on. In 1994, that was a big deal, so the fact that there's a warning was definitely a good thing. Getting back to the setting itself, the basic idea is that all of the fiction of the late 19th century is true. So it would be possible to see Sherlock Holmes hanging out with dwarvish engineers or members of the Illuminati sharing coffee with Captain Nemo. Of course, Queen Victoria is present, as is the Royal Secret Service. And this could all become a farce pretty quickly, but all the sources I checked out noted that if the major characters of fiction are kept to a minimum, Castle Faulkenstein settles into an excellent combination of steampunk and fantasy. New Europa gets a lot of love in the Spellnapped section, with each nation getting at least half a page of description. Castle Faulkenstein itself gets a rather detailed description, and Pondsmith spent a good amount of time making sure the continent has the look and feel that one would expect from this sort of game, with just enough materials presented to allow GMs to flavor their games how they see best. He also included a variation on how Victorian life and society works, and I say variation because while we actually had a Victorian age in our world, it's a bit different in the game, and those differences are easy to spot in the text. Alex White on RPG.net provides a ton of background information on this game, and without that, this particular section of the rundown would have been a lot shorter than I'd have liked, so shout out to Alex for giving us the 411 on the setting. Insofar as the game mechanics themselves, I was able to dig up quite a bit, so let's pop the engine and see what makes this baby purr. When it comes to creating characters, this system does things a little differently. Instead of stats or dice, the player will choose a hero template, and those are heroic, tragic, flawed, innocent, clever, and fallen. From there, you choose a career from a very long list that includes anarchist, diplomat, mad scientist, and steam engineer, and that's just 4 off the list. See where we're going here? Each archetype, which is what they call the career, comes complete with a list of possessions, a few aptitudes, which they call strong suits, and skills. And that's it. That's character creation. The player then starts a character diary, and one of the first, if not the first, entry or entries needs to be the character's background. From there, the player will record the details of their adventures, and the interesting thing is that it's going to be from their perspective rather than the group perspective, since each character is probably going to see a situation in different ways. It should also be noted that players can choose to play non-human characters like dwarves, dragons, and fairies, but Rick Swan noted in his review of the game, which we'll get to in a bit, that, quote, they come with so much baggage, they're barely worth the effort, end quote. As unusual as character creation is, skill resolution is even more so. As I mentioned a moment ago with character creation, dice aren't used in this game at all. A deck of playing cards is used. At the start of the game, each player and the GM are dealt 4 cards. When a skill test comes up, the GM gives the test a difficulty rating of 2 through 12. If the character's skill level is higher than the DC, it succeeds. The player can boost the skill by playing a card or multiple cards from their hand, so that's where the cards come into play. The counter to that is that the GM can play cards from their hand to increase the difficulty. Though, if the GM's the one setting the DC, are the cards really necessary? It's just a thought. Also, combat is conducted using the same method. Now, spells and spellcasters are a part of the world, so when it comes to casting spells, they get a second deck of cards. When they cast a spell, they draw cards from the deck at a rate of 1 card per 2 minutes of game time. And they do this until the sum of the cards is equal to or higher than the power of the spell. Oh, and even then it's not certain the spell succeeds. And spells can backfire, and the consequences of that can be rather dangerous, so be careful. Like I said earlier, while it took a minute to really get into the setting, once I got into that and got to see how the system works, I'm glad I took that time. Castle Faulkenstein has continued to sell at a decent rate, which is proven by the fact it's still available for purchase in print. And while our Talsorian Games keeps promising a second edition, that has yet to be seen. Castle Faulkenstein won the Origins Award for Best Role-Playing Rules of 1994 and the Nigel D. Findlay Memorial Award for Best Role-Playing Product of 1995. Okay, so I promised we'd get Rick Swan's review in here, so let's pull it from the February 1995 issue of Dragon magazine. He really loved the game. Says it was, quote, an alternative reality that's 1 part fact, 10 parts funhouse, a crazy quilt of steam age technology and social anarchy, end quote. He recommended it highly, stating, quote, this is about as good as it gets, end quote. Ken Cox reviewed the game for the November-December 1994 issue of Shadis. He called it, quote, what has to be one of the most exciting games in the industry, end quote. He added, quote, with its incredible artwork and layout, the book fairly transports you into the realms of the world while not taking away from the exchange of information, end quote. As you'd expect from the quotes, he gave it his hearty endorsement, closing by saying, quote, a surefire system with a fantastic world of adventure. And isn't that what we've all been looking for? End quote. And if you'll remember back to the episodes we did on the 1996 Arcane magazine poll of the 50 most popular role-playing games of all time, Castle Faulkenstein checked in at 45. Paul Pettengale said about the game, quote, Castle Faulkenstein is one of those games that people tend to either love or hate. It has a unique atmosphere, combining alternate history, Celtic mythology, steampunk, and a somewhat whimsical fairy tale feel. Likewise, the rulebook itself is quite different from many, being laid out as a novel with important information pulled out in sidebars and the rules coming later. This reflects the main thrust of the system, which is heavily geared towards role-playing and storytelling over game mechanics and numbers, and drops dice in favor of a couple of packs of playing cards, end quote. I think this is a pretty good point to move the tour along to our second stop for the day. Now, I need to start our history rundown with a bit of backstory. In 1982, Stephen Michael Secchi, Stephen Cordovano, and Vernie Taylor created the company Bard Games so they could publish their own supplements for Dungeons & Dragons. By 1986, there had been a number of personal and financial disagreements that had cropped up, mostly surrounding the publication of the Atlantis trilogy. Due to those, Secchi sold his shares in Bard Games to Cordovano and focused instead on creating a new role-playing game, along with the supplements to support it. However, Cordovano quickly realized he had no desire to run a game company, so he sold both his and Secchi's shares back to Secchi, and Secchi used the company to publish his new game, Talislanta. Talislanta was published in 1987 with Secchi as the sole designer. Once that was done, he published the supplements The Chronicles of Talislanta, A Naturalist's Guide to Talislanta, and Talislanta's Sorcerer's Guide, and he did that all in a very short span of time. 1 year later, Bard Games announced the second edition of Talislanta, and the Cyclopedia Talislanta was the first release. It was an 88-page softcover book that covered everything from new character types to new continental and local maps. It also included some variant rules for the game, mostly compiled from groups who'd created them to fix issues they'd had when they played the game. In 1989, Talislanta Handbook and Campaign Guide became the second release of the new edition. It was also a softcover release, though it checked in at 155 pages. It combined the Talislantan Handbook and materials from the 3 supplements, bringing those books into the new edition. Pretty much all of the rules saw at least some adjustments made, and new rules for mass combat were added to the release. The Handbook and Campaign Guide also brought in new character backgrounds, new tech, and a new introductory adventure. Bard Games would release one more book in this line, and that was 1990's Talislanta Workbook, which is a 183-page atlas. It covered the work of Archos and the continent of Talislanta in a level of detail that none of the other books had been able to do previously. Now, as I mentioned, the Atlas was the last book in the line, as well as the last release of any type from Bard Games, as they went out of business shortly after the Atlas's release. But we're not done with the history of Talislanta by a long shot. Nay, nay. In 1992, a little-known, very small, and very new company picked up the license to Talislanta. It's a company that I think might have a little bit of success in the game world. Wizards of the Coast. They immediately got to work on a 3rd edition, and Jonathan Tweet teamed up with Stephen Michael Secchi to work out the details. The Talislanta Guidebook was the first release. Dropped in 1992, it checked in at 344 pages of softcover goodness. It completely reworked the magic system for the game and moved the history of Talislanta as a whole forward 20 years. Talislanta Geographica was next. It was also released in 1992, and it was a rather small release, 16 pages and a softcover. However, we saw some of the trademarks of future Wizards of the Coast releases here. A GM screen, a poster map of the continent of Talislanta, and descriptions of the environments and weather patterns. Text came courtesy of Peter Atkinson and George Lowe, and the included adventures were written by Jeff Goldman and George Lowe. 1992 also saw the Arcane Codex. Stephen Michael Secchi handled this one himself, and it was a 180-page softcover book that updated the magic rules even further, detailing spells, skills, magic items, and books. The final release for the year was The Scent of the Beast. Jonathan Tweet was the designer, and it was the first full-length adventure written by Wizards of the Coast for Talislanta. 1993 saw two more releases. The first was Thystrom's Collectanea. Written by Stephen Michael Secchi and checking in at 150 pages, this book updated the various beasts, flora, and fauna of the world. The other 1993 release was Quantrigue. Written by Secchi along with Tony Herring, it was the second full-length adventure for the system. Sarista was released in 1994. Checking in at 72 pages, Mike McDonald and Peter Atkinson took an in-depth look at the nomadic people of Talislanta known as the Sarista. Wizards of the Coast would release one more book for Talislanta, 1994's Sub-Men Rising. Written by Robin Laws, it was the third full-length adventure published for the game. On the final page of the book, WotC made an announcement. This would be the final book published by Wizards of the Coast, and Talislanta products would continue with another company. Now, that company was supposed to be Daedalus Entertainment, which many of you may remember as the company that produced Feng Shui, but the company went out of business before they could get any Talislanta product out to market. So Talislanta went 3 years without a home before Pharaoh's Press picked up the license in 1997. Their goal was to publish a 10th anniversary book for the game, but their vision went way beyond that. They planned to expand upon and revise all of the previously published materials before combining it into one book. It turns out that might have been a bit too ambitious. They ran into delay after delay in the production, and they failed to produce any publishable product before the end of 1997. So, since they missed the anniversary, which was the whole point of them getting the license in the first place, Stephen Michael Secchi pulled the license and Pharos was out of the Talislanta game. So let's fast forward to 2001. Shooting Iron, a very small publishing company, picked up the license and released Talislanta Fantasy Role-Playing. A very hefty 502-page book, it was officially tagged as the 4th edition of the game and was heavily influenced by the failed Pharaoh's Press release. Shooting Iron also released Midnight Realm in 2005. It was a 152-page book that detailed the plane of existence known as the Darkness, which was a fairly uncovered area of the game previously. Now, after it published The Darkness, Shooting Iron relinquished the license. But Morrigan Press picked it up almost immediately and dropped a series of supplements. Talislanta Menagerie came out in 2005. It's an updated bestiary for the new edition. Codex Magicus also came out in 2005, and it updated the magic system. The Northern Reaches detailed the Arctic regions of Talislanta when it was also released in 2005. The Weight of Water was Morgan Press's first and only adventure. It came out in 2005. The Chronicles of Talislanta also came out in 2005. It was a revised and updated version of the first edition release. I'm kind of sensing a theme here. You'll see why. 2005 also saw The Darkness, which revised Shooting Iron's Midnight Realm release. Last up in 2005 were the Talislanta cardstock minis. I think it's pretty obvious what those were. People and Places Jaffa came out in 2006. It detailed the nomadic desert tribes known as the Jaffa. And Riding the Sky was the final release for 4th edition, coming out in 2006. It's a book about wind sailors, and I'll leave that for you to pick up a copy of the book and find out for yourself. Now, Morrigan Press did technically release another 4th edition book, but I didn't include it in the last list because it was a D20 conversion of the game titled Talislanta D20 Edition. And I think we've said enough about that. Now, Morrigan Press wasn't finished with Talislanta. In 2006, they announced they'd worked up a 5th edition of the game, and in that announcement, they'd noted they'd revised the magic system a bit, as well as created a variant character generation system. Between the announcement in 2006 and the end of 2007, 4 books were released. Hotan's History of the World came out in 2006. It revised and expanded the geography, people, and major urban centers of Talislanta. The Menagerie came out in 2007. This was the updated bestiary. A Player's Guide to Talislanta was the 5th edition core book. It detailed all the changes, including some for combat that hadn't been previously announced. A Game Master's Guide to Talislanta was the final release, also in 2007. It had new rule variants, new races, and new magic orders. I mentioned it was the final release, and that's because Morrigan Press went out of business in 2008. Now, needless to say, all of the books I've detailed here are out of print, so if you're interested in one of these, check your used gamer bookshop or drivethroughrpg.com. But if you want shiny and new, there is another option out there. Early in 2023, Everything Epic announced a crowdfunding campaign on GameFound.com for a new edition of Talislanta that they call the Epic Edition or the 6th and final edition. Stephen Michael Secchi is back for this, and he's joined by Christopher Batarlis. The promo for the campaign refers to this as the ultimate version of the game, with Secchi having worked through his extensive notes and books to include the best of Talislanta throughout the history of the game. And as you'd expect from a new release, 16 years after the last one, it's got all new art, characters, archetypes. You're getting the picture. It's also been stated that this version will include the entire final vision Secchi had for the universe. The release is going to consist of 4 books. The Talislanta core book, of course, that'll be the rule book for the edition, and it'll have all the goodies you need to play. The Bestiary of Talislanta, pretty sure you know what that's going to have in it. The Atlas of Talislanta, again, I'm pretty sure you know what this is. The 5th edition conversion book. So this requires a bit of explaining. This was all intended to be a part of the core book, but after all of the Wizards of the Coast open game license crap earlier in the year, Everything Epic put out their own Creative Commons. So they pulled this from the core book and are making it its own book, giving those who want a 5e feel all the conversion materials necessary to do that very thing. Now, I checked GameFound.com to make sure the campaign was still on track, and since it has well exceeded its goal, it reports it will release to backers at some point in November of 2023, with a full release to the public sometime in December. Oh, and the hype on the site makes constant references to the fact that after 35 years, Talislanta still doesn't have any elves in it. Just so you know. Now, I mentioned the Creative Commons a moment ago, so let me just read it to you word for word. Talislanta is released to the world for free under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike license. You are free to download the books for your role-playing pleasure as long as you don't use it commercially and distribute it under the same license terms with the respective attribution of its owner. For more information, please read the Creative Commons license terms. Now, my assumption is that the 5e they referred to in the hype materials is the 5th edition of Talislanta, but it wouldn't surprise me if they meant D&D 5th edition because, well, why not? Over the years, Talislanta has been translated into Italian, German, and French, and for the record, the French edition, which is published by Ludopathes Editeurs, works off the 4th edition rules, but has produced 7 books and 7 PDFs over the years, with no signs of stopping anytime soon. In various interviews over the years, Stephen Michael Secchi has credited the Dying Earth fantasy novel series from Jack Vance as the primary influence for Talislanta, though he notes Lovecraft, Marco Polo, and Sir Richard Burton's Arabian Nights are also influences. Okay, so for a release with this much history, you'd expect an equal amount of setting and mechanical information, right? Well, I apologize for disappointing you because that was way harder to find than the historical information was. What I can report is that the setting is the continent of Talislanta, which is located on the world known as Arceus. Magic is everywhere and is a very high tech. When it comes to character creation, I was expecting an odd system that either pulled from multiple different systems or something Secchi created from whole cloth. And for 1st through 4th edition, it sort of was. The characters were basically pre-generated. There were more than 80 character types available, sorted by race, nationality, ability scores, skills, equipment, and background. Players could individualize them a bit by increasing an ability by 3 points, decreasing an ability by a point, and adding a skill. Otherwise, it was pick and play. Now, 5th edition radically altered this, though that radical change was to make character creation pretty much like every other role-playing game on the market. And I have to admit, I kind of found task resolution to be a boring process. Regardless of what needed to be done, be it combat, magic, skills, whatever, a single table was used along with a d20, and there are 5 possible results: mishap, failure, partial success, full success, and critical success. The determining factor is the difference between the result gained and the difficulty rating of the test. Now, all of that being said, Talislanta is a very well-defined world that I think would be very interesting to play in. I'm just not all that sure about the system itself, necessarily. The critics, however, seem to love it. Stuart Week handled the review for the 1988 issue of White Wolf, that was issue number 11. He gave it a 9 out of 10 and said, quote, "The true strength of Talislanta is its uniqueness. Here's a fantasy world without orcs and goblins and all those standard enemies. I highly recommend this world as a place where your imagination can run wild," end quote. Jim Bambra reviewed it for the March 1989 issue of Dragon, and he called it, quote, "something out of the ordinary," end quote. The art was, in his opinion, quote, "visually appealing and does an excellent job of conveying the atmosphere, places, and people of Talislanta. A flick through any of the 4 books reveals that Talislanta is special," end quote. His final remarks were, quote, "some may find the Talislantan game system thin on rules and mechanics, but it does an admirable job of handling all kinds of tests without interrupting the flow of the game. With only a few rules to learn, you can concentrate on role-playing rather than rule-playing," end quote. So I guess it just goes to show what I know. And with that, we've come to the end of today's tour. Next week, we check out Advanced Fighting Fantasy, which means we also need to check out Fighting Fantasy and Sorcery, since they're all basically part of the same game. In the meantime, check out Bad GM's campaign Build Along. This week, we take our group into Forest Park, which is a place they'd always heard you should never go into. Last time they were in the area, they saw some pretty nasty stuff run out of there, so the idea of going in there has them a bit off kilter. Should be an interesting adventure. Bad GM's campaign Build Along is available wherever you get your podcasts or on our website, badgmproductions.net. The music we use for this show comes from Pixabay.com. Check them out for all your license-free, royalty-free music needs. Roleplaying History is a production of Bad GM Productions. We are all over social media, so check out the info box for this episode or our website, badgmproductions.net, to find out where you can follow us. Next week, we get advanced. No, wait a minute, I read that wrong. We cover the Advanced Fantasy Fighting Game. Gotcha. That's next week. Until then, I'm Wayne Davis, and your Role-Playing History.